The early days of the nuclear standoff were heavily stacked against the Soviet Union. The USSR managed to detonate its own atomic bomb 4 years after the Americans. Even so, it still lagged severely behind in the overall size of its nuclear arsenal. But the biggest problem was that the Soviet military simply lacked a reliable way to deliver this weapon to the United States. There was an urgent need to build an entire fleet of strategic bombers. These aircraft had to be capable of pulling off this massive mission. Interestingly, the word strategic was rarely used in the Soviet Union at the time. They preferred the term long-range bomber. However, their new objectives were truly global in scale. The doctrine dictated that even a small formation of these heavy bombers could decide the outcome of an entire war. Their targets included government and military command centers, large troop concentrations, and industrial hubs. The goal was to deal a crushing blow to the enemy infrastructure and population. This would ensure that any further resistance would be impossible. The primary weapon for this apocalyptic scenario was, of course, a nuclear payload. So the core requirement for the engineers was clear. They needed a bomber capable of carrying this deadly payload deep into enemy territory. The standard combat payload had to be around 11,000 pounds or 5 metric tons. This was the exact weight of the first Soviet nuclear bomb. At the same time, the required operational range was a staggering 7,500 miles. Back then, interceptors formed the backbone of air defense. To have any chance of surviving, the new Soviet bomber had to cruise at speeds around 560 to 590 miles per hour. It also had to fly at massive altitudes, anywhere from 39,000 to 43,000 feet. These demanding specs were intended to make it nearly impossible for early jet fighters to intercept them. Of course, they could not rule out the risk entirely. That is why the designers were handed another strict requirement. The bomber needed to carry formidable defensive armament. On top of that, the crew had to be capable of flying combat sorties at night and in all weather conditions. They also had to execute precise bomb drops, even through thick cloud cover. For these massive, heavy bombers to take to the skies, entirely new airfields with reinforced concrete runways had to be built. These strips needed to be anywhere from 10,000 to over 16,000 feet long and up to 300 feet wide. The decision was made to hand this critical program over to aircraft designer Andrei Tupolev. Joseph Stalin personally summoned him for the job. However, Tupolev refused. He stated that given their current level of technology, meeting all the stringent military requirements was simply impossible. The bottleneck was engine technology. Early turbojets were notoriously thirsty. This made the required intercontinental range unattainable. And while turboprop engines were far more fuel efficient, they could not deliver the necessary speed and altitude. Tupolev managed to persuade the leadership and received authorization to build an intercontinental bomber powered by turboprops. That is how the Tu-95 Bear was born. The logic was simple. To reach the shores of North America, they had to prioritize maximum range, even if it meant sacrificing top speed. But there was another designer willing to tackle the challenge of building a pure jet-powered heavy bomber. That designer was Vladimir Myasishchev, a former student of Tupolev. During World War II, he managed several design bureaus and aviation plants. However, after the war, his design bureau was shut down because it had never successfully put an aircraft into mass production. Myasishchev was relegated to working as an instructor at an aviation institute. Having previously faced political persecution during the purges, his career prospects seemed bleak. But unexpectedly, he was tapped to head up a completely new design bureau. This was the team tasked with the highly demanding mission of designing the new intercontinental jet bomber. The reason behind this decision was that Myasishchev had been conducting in-depth research, running simulations of real combat scenarios. In one scenario, a Soviet bomber flight path took it within 130 to 180 miles of an enemy interceptor base. That was the standard tactic used during the air war in Europe. Those bases would be home to the latest American P-80 jet interceptors. Thanks to these complex calculations, Myasishchev figured out exactly what kind of performance specs a jet bomber needed to actually break through a dense air defense network. Compiling his findings into a single proposal, he sent it straight to the aviation ministry. This kicked off the development of the new aircraft. In the spring of 1951, specifically on March 24th, the Soviet government officially approved the project. One of Moscow aviation plants was selected as the production facility. Strict deadlines were immediately put in place. Generous funding was allocated, and partnerships were established with other facilities across the Soviet Union. The new design bureau quickly filled out its roster with specialists, backed by promises of full support from the highest levels of government. Top-tier talent was transferred from other chief designers, including structural engineers and top aerodynamicists from Alexander Yakovlev, Vladimir Chelomey, and other renowned aircraft builders. Entire teams were relocated, drafting boards and all. Naturally, no one wanted to give up their best people without a fight, but high-ranking project supervisors stepped in, including Georgy Melenkov, Nikolai Bulganin, and Lavrenti Beria. The power these men wielded was virtually limitless. Incredibly, there was a dedicated telephone hanging right at the factory gate, allowing any worker to call straight into Beria office to report perceived sabotage. Thanks to this strict oversight, the new bureau was assembled incredibly fast, securing some of the best minds in the business. Many of these specialists already had experience working under Myasishchev. The roster included outstanding engineers like Leonid Selyakov, Yakov Nodelman, Georgy Matveyev, Konstantin Popov, and Georgy Arkangelsky. The newly formed Design Bureau inherited an incredibly advanced and modern production facility. This Moscow plant traced its roots back to December 1922. It originally operated as a joint venture with the German aircraft manufacturer Junkers, making it a pioneer in Soviet all-metal aircraft construction. Later, in 1948, it geared up for mass production of the heavy piston-engine Tu-4 bombers. Eventually, it started assembling the initial production run of the jet-powered Tu-14. The facility boasted a highly experienced workforce and state-of-the-art tooling, including high-precision machinery brought over from Germany after World War II. The future aircraft received the highly classified factory designation of Project M. Internal documents often referred to it as the high-speed, long-range bomber. The government demanded quick results, making the time allotted for preliminary designs brutally short. The engineers did not have the luxury of evaluating multiple design alternatives, even though they were facing a task of unprecedented complexity. In reality, Myasishchev team could not perfect a design of this magnitude right out of the gate. But then again, Tupolev was experiencing similar difficulties at the time. So was Boeing, which was actively working on its B-52 Stratofortress during those exact same years. Despite the frantic pace, the engineers made a number of fundamentally new and unconventional design choices. Without these risky decisions, the project would have never gotten off the ground. Now we will dive into the aerodynamics and the most important design choices. After carefully analyzing all viable power plant options, Myasishchev concluded that the only acceptable choice was the AM-3 turbojet engine, developed under the leadership of Alexander Mikulin. Each of these engines produced a massive 19,180 pounds of thrust. While they were heavy and notorious for their massive fuel consumption, their immense thrust meant that only 4 engines had to be used on the aircraft. This spared the engineers from designing a complex multi-engine configuration, like the ones used on the massive American B-36 and B-52 bombers. During the early stages of development, they even considered using JATO rockets, or a giant rocket sled catapult for takeoff, before eventually abandoning those radical concepts. In aerodynamics, the absolute gold standard in military aviation at the time was the 35-degree swept wing. This ideal sweep angle had been determined during the development of the MiG-15 fighter and the Tu-16 bomber. However, calculations showed that the aerodynamic drag of a 35-degree wing was far too high for such a heavy aircraft. The bomber simply would not be able to reach its target top speed. Myasishchev took a bold step and increased the wing sweep even further. This was a gamble, as increasing the sweep inevitably degraded the low-speed handling of the aircraft during takeoff and landing. To make an aircraft lighter, engineers historically placed the engines out on the wings, away from the fuselage. The physical weight of the engines provided bending relief by counteracting the upward force of lift, allowing for a thinner wing structure. However, potted engines created significant parasitic drag. The designers of the M aircraft took a different approach, burying the engines deep inside the thickened wing roots, nearly flush with the airframe. The powerful jet exhaust accelerated the airflow over the inboard section of the wing, acting as a virtual aerodynamic fence that smoothed out the airflow and kept the aircraft highly stable in this critical area. Swept wings are highly susceptible to tip stall, a sudden loss of lift at the outer edges of the wing that can cause the aircraft to violently snap into a spin. For the M aircraft, the engineers utilized geometric twist or washout. The outer wing was built with a noticeably lower angle of incidence than the wing root. If the airplane pitched up to a high angle of attack and the wing roots began to stall, the wing tips kept flying. As a result, the bomber would naturally drop its nose and smoothly recover. In the late 1940s, the United States introduced a highly flexible swept wing on the B-47 Stratojet, designed to safely bend in flight to save weight. This concept was later carried over to the B-52 Stratofortress. Soviet designers learned of this development, and despite criticism from domestic aerospace experts, Myasishchev decided to follow suit. In flight, the M-bomber wingtips were projected to flex by roughly 6.5 feet. During static load tests, engineers successfully deflected the wingtips over 16 feet from their resting position without causing structural damage. To bring this aircraft to life, the team utilized high-strength aluminum alloys never before seen in heavy aircraft construction. These materials offered a significantly higher strength-to-weight ratio. However, due to their increased rigidity, they were highly susceptible to accelerated metal fatigue under cyclical loading. During a typical 15-hour mission, the wings would undergo over 2,500 flexing cycles. The design bureau managed to engineer a reliable airframe with a robust structural safety margin, proven by years of active flight service. Designing the landing gear proved to be a major challenge. They settled on an unconventional bicycle landing gear layout, relying on two main gear struts positioned along the fuselage center line, each equipped with 4 wheel bogies. Small outrigger wheels near the wingtips prevented the bomber from tipping over. This setup freed up internal volume and drastically reduced the aircraft overall weight compared to a traditional tricycle configuration. Earlier Soviet tests on the experimental I-211 fighter showed that a bicycle gear makes it incredibly difficult to rotate the aircraft during the takeoff roll. To solve this without adding massive aerodynamic drag from a permanently tall nose strut, designers integrated a special hydraulic mechanism inside the nose strut. As the bomber gathered speed and the wings generated lift, the system automatically tilted the nose gear bogie so that only the rear pair of wheels remained on the ground, pitching the nose up to the perfect angle for liftoff. The offensive arsenal included conventional free-fall bombs ranging from roughly 1,100 to nearly 20,000 pounds, as well as naval mines, torpedoes, and guided bombs. The maximum bomb load reached 53,000 pounds, twice as much as the Tu-95 could haul. Defensive armament featured 3 remote-controlled twin-barrel cannon turrets, providing full 360-degree coverage without any blind spots. By comparison, American designers equipped the B-52 with just a single-tail turret, calculating that the chances of a head-on intercept against a high-speed jet bomber were negligible. At maximum speeds, the aerodynamic loads on the flight controls were too strong for a pilot to manually overpower. While Tupolev refined mechanical controls for the slower Tu-16, the jet-powered M-bomber demanded hydraulic actuators. The pilot manipulated the hydraulics via lightweight linkages, and physical resistance on the yoke was simulated using artificial feel springs. For emergencies, the bomber was equipped with downward-firing ejection seats for all crew members. Development required massive groundwork, including full-scale mock-ups and flying laboratories. 3 Tu-4 bombers were converted to test the landing gear, engines, and flight controls in the air. Construction of the first prototype began in May 1952. Due to a short factory runway, it was broken down, transported by truck to a larger test facility, and reassembled. The prototype made its maiden flight on January 20, 1953, piloted by a crew led by Fyodor Opachi. During factory testing, engineers discovered serious structural issues, hydraulic glitches, and severe nose gear shimmy. There were highly dangerous in-flight emergencies, including one flight where the elevator began to disintegrate in mid-air, though Opachi managed to land safely. The most critical issue, however, was that the bomber failed to meet the required operational range. Following the crash of the rival Tu-95 prototype in May 1953, The M aircraft was pushed toward a small pre-production run, but Myasishchev was tasked with immediately improving performance. The biggest challenge was excessive weight. The aircraft maximum takeoff weight reached 400,000 pounds, exceeding available engine thrust. Management offered cash bonuses for every kilogram of weight shaved off. Additionally, finding excess directional stability allowed engineers to shorten the fuselage by over 3 feet. The updated prototype, designated DM, featured a shortened fuselage, increased flap area, and deflection angles. It made its maiden flight in January 1954 and was publicly debuted during the May Day parade, prompting NATO to assign it the reporting name Bison. State trials confirmed a top speed of 590 miles per hour at 22,000 feet and a service ceiling of 40,300 feet. However, range tests on the DM variant achieved only 5,800 miles instead of the planned 7,500. The massive testing campaign officially wrapped up in July 1955, declaring the bomber fit for operational use under the designation M-4. Preparation for series production happened at a frantic pace, transitioning from the electrical systems of the Tu-4 to the complex hydraulics of the M-4 required entirely new production shops and clean rooms. Early airframes were practically hand-fitted. This wreaked havoc on production schedules, and the pressure on the workforce remained intense due to strict production quotas. Many at the plant had internalized a grim rule from the Gulag days: work in a way that cuts down your sentence. Despite the grueling effort, the plant managed to roll out 32 production aircraft. Tragically, 3 crashed almost immediately. One was lost in a thunderstorm, and another went down due to a sudden in-flight fire sparked by a ruptured fuel line after weight-saving measures recklessly removed mounting brackets. The third crash occurred during a factory test flight piloted by Ilya Pronin and Valentin Kokinaki. The bomber rotated sharply off the runway almost immediately after its unique nose gear extension mechanism kicked in. The heavy jet continued uncontrollably pitching up until it banked sharply, dropped a wing, and crashed. Investigations revealed a critical aerodynamic flaw. Under certain conditions, the M4 wing stopped generating lift, resulting in a severe uncommanded nose-up pitch. The aircraft operated with incredibly tight margins, pulling back on the yoke slightly too hard during takeoff. Catching a random gust of wind or experiencing a slight variation in landing gear dynamics was enough to trigger an unrecoverable stall. During another flight, test pilot Fyodor Opadchi experienced a similar uncommanded pitch-up. Recognizing the stall, he shoved the yoke full forward, physically forcing the nose down and slamming the nose gear hard back onto the concrete before safely climbing away. To mitigate this flaw, engineers restricted elevator travel by more than half, added visual pitch indicators to the instrument panel, and rewrote takeoff procedures to include strict calculations based on gross weight, center of gravity, and weather conditions. Despite the teething problems, the M4 made history as the world's first heavy jet-powered strategic bomber to enter operational service. The military, however, demanded a major boost in flight range. Upgrading to afterburning AM-3F engines or the more efficient VD-7 engines was considered, but structural reinforcement requirements and production delays ruled them out. Ultimately, the proven AM-3 remained the standard power plant. The only practical way to extend the range was aerial refueling. The M4 adopted a probe and drogue system designated Konus, developed by Sergei Alexeyev. Factory tests were demanding. The bow wave coming off the receiver aircraft nose caused the tanker drogue basket to oscillate wildly, making hookups exceptionally difficult. Test pilot Nikolai Goryanov developed a successful technique of matching speed, holding position, and rapidly extending the probe. After resolving issues with severe fuel leaks and tearing drogues, state trials concluded successfully. In February 1957, an endurance flight featuring 2 aerial refuelings covered over 10,000 miles over 17 hours. Within Soviet long-range aviation, M4s were primarily operated from Engels Air Base under the command of Serafim Biryukov and Anatoly Ivanov. Transitioning pilots found the sheer size and power of the aircraft intimidating. Once familiarized, they realized every M4 had unique handling characteristics. Rigging the flight controls was tedious, and pre-flight checklists were exhausting. The aircraft's tight angle of attack margins made every landing a test of nerves. If the nose dropped slightly below the glide path, the aircraft would violently porpoise. If pitched too high, it could stall. The anti-skid braking system was initially unreliable, causing tire blowouts and frequent runway excursions. Maintaining the landing gear was a logistical, massive undertaking, requiring the entire aircraft to be defueled and hoisted onto 6 enormous jacks just to change a tire. Furthermore, the environmental control system was poor, subjecting crews to extreme cold at altitude and severe heat during taxi. The hydraulic flight control system was prone to sudden pressure drops, requiring grueling emergency drilling. The primary weapon of the M4 was a thermonuclear bomb with a 3-megaton yield, alongside lower-yield nuclear weapons. Taking off from Engels Air Base, the bombers could only reach targets in Canada. To strike the United States, they relied on forward operating bases in the Baltics and the Far East. Missions were planned as high-altitude formation flights, relying on overlapping fields of fire from the bombers' defensive cannons to deter interceptors. Once over the target area, the formation would break up for individual attack runs. For targets beyond the bomber return radius, operations were planned as one-way missions, with crews instructed to fly over the ocean, bail out, and await submarine recovery after completing their strike. By 1958, high accident rates forced a temporary grounding of the M4 fleet. Engineers carried out major upgrades to the landing gear and flight controls. Because the more advanced 3M bomber was entering service, leadership decided to convert the remaining operational M4s into dedicated aerial refueling tankers. They operated in 2 specialized squadrons based in Lithuania and the Far East, providing critical refueling support for Soviet long-range aviation until the end of their service lives.